The air in the Incheon shipping yards didn't move. It suffocated. It was a thick, briny soup of diesel fumes and the metallic tang of drying blood. Here, in the gallows, the sun didn't set so much as it drowned in the gray silt of the Yellow Sea. In the center of a cleared shipping crate circle, a boy stood holding a rusted shard of a freighter's hull. He was 12 years old, his ribs counting themselves against his skin, his eyes wide and vacant, the look of a creature that had stopped expecting a savior. Across from him stood Madame Kane. She wasn't a mother, and she wasn't a teacher. She was a storm in a tailored charcoal suit, her dark skin glowing under the harsh amber work lights, a cigarette dangling from her gold-capped teeth. "They aren't coming back, little bird," she said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp that cut through the sound of the crashing surf. Chairman Kang signed the paper. The Trinity got their trade routes. The beasts got a toy. You are the price of peace. She tossed a heavy, salt-crusted wooden crane at his feet, a relic from the nursery he had been snatched from 48 hours prior. The boy didn't pick it up. He looked at the crane, then at the shard of steel in his hand, and finally at the woman who had spent the last 2 days hunting him through the rusted skeletons of ships. "Survival isn't a right, Junho," Kane whispered, leaning down until he could smell the expensive tobacco and the cold iron on her breath. "It is a conquest. Now, show me if you're a Kang, or if you're just meat." 20 years later, the silence in Seoul was different. It was expensive. The Kang Corporate Plaza was a monolith of glass and arrogance, rising above the city like a middle finger to the heavens. There was no rain tonight, only a heavy, humid stillness that made the neon lights of the surrounding district feel oppressive. At the main security gate, the sensors hummed with a soft blue light. A black sedan, matte finished and devoid of license plates, sat idling at the curb. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He wore a heavy, charcoal-gray tech hanbok, the stiff fabric rustling like a warning. He moved with a terrifying, predatory economy of motion. No wasted energy, no unnecessary breath. His skin was a map of the gallows, jagged white lines from knife fights and chemical burns that told the story of 2 decades spent among the beasts. He carried a long, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth, slung across his back. It didn't look like a sword. It looked like a fragment of a nightmare. The guard at the gate, a young man who had never seen the inside of a shipyard, stepped forward, hand hovering over his holster. "This is private property. Identification." Junho didn't look at the guard. He looked at the tower, his eyes cold and analytical, calculating the structural weaknesses of a dynasty. He reached into a deep pocket of his hanbok and pulled out an object. He placed it on the high-tech glass of the security scanner. It was the wooden crane. It was blackened by time, pitted by salt, and stained with the ancient brownish hue of a child's blood. The guard stared at the toy, confused. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" "It's a default notice," Junho said. His voice was a dead calm, the sound of a blade being drawn across a whetstone. "Tell Chairman Kang that the collateral has returned, and I've come to collect the interest." He didn't wait for a response. As the guard reached for his radio, Junho's hand moved toward the oilcloth on his back. The air seemed to chill. The peace of the Trinity, bought with a child's soul 20 years ago, had just expired. The god of the blade had entered the garden, and he had brought the hunger of the beasts with him. The tea house was tucked into a fold of Bukchon, where the skyscrapers of Central Seoul seemed to retreat into the shadows, out of respect or perhaps out of fear. It was a place of dark wood and paper screens, a silent vacuum preserved in the center of a screaming city. Inside, the only sound was the rhythmic hiss of a bamboo whisk against ceramic. So-hee sat with her back to the alcove, her posture a masterpiece of corporate refinement. As Chairman Kang's lead tactical analyst, she was paid to see the invisible, the fluctuations in market sentiment, the cracks in a rival's armor, the shifting winds of political favor. But as the sliding door groaned open, she felt a sensation her data models couldn't predict. A sudden, sharp drop in the room's temperature, as if the night air had followed a predator inside. Junho did not sit immediately. He stood in the entryway, a shadow carved out of the darkness. The charcoal tech hanbok he wore absorbed the soft amber light of the floor lamps. Across his back, the spine of the Leviathan remained wrapped in oilcloth, yet its presence was as heavy as a mountain. The security feed at the plaza was scrubbed within 90 seconds of your departure, so he said, her voice steady, though her fingers tightened, almost imperceptibly around her tea bowl. The guard is in a medical coma. The chairman has called an emergency session of the Trinity Council. You didn't just knock on the door, Junho. You broke the glass. Junho moved then, his footsteps making no sound on the tatami mats. He sat opposite her, his movements possessing a terrifying fluid grace, the predatory economy Madame Kane had beaten into his marrow. He placed his hands on his knees. His knuckles were thick, scarred, and steady. The chairman always hated a mess, Junho replied. His voice was a low vibration, the sound of tectonic plates grinding together. He prefers his blood spilled in shipping yards where the tide can wash it away, not on his front porch. So he looked at him, really looked at him. She didn't see a long-lost nephew or a victim of a tragic past. She saw a living relic of a war the city thought it had won. He thinks you're a ghost seeking a haunting. He's already moved his liquid assets and doubled the guard at the Incheon refineries. He thinks this is about a grievance. Grievances are for the emotional, Junho said, his cold, analytical eyes locking onto hers. This is an audit. 20 years of compound interest on a life sold for a trade route. I am not here to haunt him. I am here to liquidate him. So he set her tea down. This was the moment of the transaction, the reason she had risked a career of absolute loyalty to the Kang name. She reached into her sleeve and pulled out a slim, encrypted drive, sliding it across the low table. The Trinity isn't a family anymore. It's a ledger, she explained. The 3 pillars, Kang, Park, and Choi, are held together by a single hub, the Incheon Clearinghouse. That's where the beasts deliver the off-book cargo. If the clearinghouse falls, the Trinity's credit defaults. They'll turn on each other within a week. Junho's gaze dropped to the drive. And your price? I don't want money. And I don't want a seat at a table that's about to be burned for firewood. So he said, her eyes flashing with a rare, sharp spark of resentment. I've spent 10 years calculating the cost of the chairman's peace. I've watched him sacrifice better people than you just to stay on top of the pile. I want to see the math finally balance. I want to be the one who watches the towers fall from a safe distance. Junho picked up the drive. The contact of his scarred skin against the sleek plastic was a collision of 2 worlds, the rust of the gallows and the silicon of the Seoul Heights. There is a shipment arriving at Dock 4 tonight, so he continued, her voice dropping to a professional whisper. It's not cargo. It's the new enforcement team the chairman hired to replace the men you dismantled at the gate. They aren't shipyard scavengers. They're professionals. Ex-Special Forces, kitted with the best tech the Trinity's money can buy. Junho stood up, the oilcloth-wrapped blade shifting with a dull clank. Good. The beasts at the docks were hungry, but they were honest. I've missed the smell of salt and iron. They'll be expecting a man with a sword, so he warned, standing to face him. Junho paused at the door, the silhouette of his tech handbook cutting a jagged hole in the room's serenity. He looked back at her, and for a fleeting second, so he saw the child who had been left among the beasts, not in his eyes, which remained frozen, but in the absolute, terrifying stillness of his soul. They are expecting a man, Junho said. They are going to find a consequence. He stepped out into the night, vanishing into the shadows of the Bukchon alleys before the sliding door had even finished closing. So he remained in the silent tea house, the steam rising from her untouched bowl. She had just handed the keys of the kingdom to a god of the blade, and for the first time in her life, the data told her that the coming storm was exactly what the city deserved. The audit had begun. The first payment was due at midnight. The Incheon clearinghouse sat on the edge of the world, a fortress of corrugated steel and reinforced concrete that smelled of stagnant tide and ozone. It was the Trinity's lungs, breathing in contraband and exhaling the black market capital that kept the glass towers in Seoul standing. Inside the central hub, the hum of high-end servers competed with the rhythmic thud of the cranes outside. 12 men occupied the floor, Chairman Kang's Pro 6 team. They didn't look like the dock scavengers Junho had grown up with. They wore pressurized tactical vests, thermal optics, and carried suppressed submachine guns. They moved in overlapping arcs of fire, their communications silent through bone conduction headsets. They were the peak of military technology, hired to kill a ghost. High above the server racks, perched on a rusted crossbeam, Junho watched them. He didn't use optics. His eyes had adjusted to the dark of ship hulls years ago. He breathed slow, shallow breaths, matching the frequency of the building's industrial hum. He reached behind his shoulder and gripped the handle of the spine of the Leviathan. He didn't draw it with a flourish. He unwrapped the oilcloth with agonizing slowness, letting the heavy fabric fall like a dead weight. The blade was a slab of blackened industrial steel, nearly 5 feet of raw, cleaving power that had been sharpened until the edge was invisible. It didn't reflect the light. It seemed to consume it. One of the mercenaries stopped beneath the beam. He sensed a change in the air pressure, the subtle displacement of a body in motion. He looked up, his thermal goggles flaring red. He didn't have time to scream. Junho dropped like a stone, the weight of his body and the steel slab combined. The blade didn't cut the man. It erased the space he occupied. The mercenary was cleaved from shoulder to hip, the force of the strike cracking the concrete floor beneath him. The room erupted. Contact, northwest quadrant. Red laser sights crisscrossed the dark, stitching patterns through the dust. Suppressed fire whispered through the air, thwip, 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 shredding the server casings. Junho was already gone. He didn't move like a soldier. He moved like the beasts Madame Kane had raised him with. He used the environment, sliding under the heavy cabling, vaulting over the cooling units, a charcoal blur in the peripheral vision of men trained for static warfare. He appeared behind the second man, the spine swinging in a horizontal arc. The blade caught the mercenary across the midsection, slicing through tactical ceramic and spine alike as if they were wet paper. Junho didn't stop to admire the work. He stepped into the path of the third man, parrying a burst of 9mm rounds with the flat of his massive blade. The sparks showered his face, illuminating the cold, dead vacuum of his expression. He kicked the mercenary's lead leg, snapping the bone, and finished the arc of his blade through the man's throat. 3 down. 40 seconds had passed. The leader of the Pro Six, a man with a jagged scar across his nose, signaled for a defensive perimeter. "Flashbangs! Burn the room!" 2 canisters arched through the air. The explosion was blinding, a white-hot scream of light and sound meant to shatter the senses. The mercenaries waited for the stumble, the cough, the hesitation. Junho emerged from the white smoke, his eyes unblinking. He had been blinded by shipyard welding torches as a child. He had been deafened by the roar of freighter engines. This was nothing. He reached the center of their formation. The spine of the Leviathan became a whirlwind of heavy iron. He didn't use the finesse of a fencer. He used the physics of an executioner. He took a hit to the shoulder, a grazing round that tore his tech handbook, and paid it back by removing the shooter's arm at the socket. He spun, the sheer centrifugal force of the heavy blade pulling him through the air, shearing through a server rack and the 2 men behind it in a single catastrophic blow. The leader backed away, his weapon jammed. He reached for a sidearm, but Junho was already there, the tip of the blackened slab resting against the man's sternum. The silence returned to the clearinghouse, heavier than before. The only sound was the cooling fans of the dying servers and the wet, rhythmic drip of blood hitting the floor. Junho didn't look at the bodies. He didn't look at the blood. He walked to the main terminal, his boots clicking on the concrete. He reached into his handbook and pulled out the drive Sohee had given him. He plugged it in. The screen flickered. The Trinity's financial ledgers, the audit, began to upload. Millions of dollars in untraceable credit began to vanish into the digital ether, redirected to accounts that didn't exist 20 years ago. The leader of the mercenaries groaned, clutching his ruined chest. Who are you?" Junho stood by the terminal, the blue light of the screen reflecting in his eyes. He didn't answer. He reached down and picked up a heavy leather-bound ledger from the desk. The physical record of every man who had profited from the Incheon consolidation. He tucked the book into his belt. The audit was moving from the digital to the physical. He turned toward the exit, the spine of the Leviathan trailing behind him, leaving a dark, jagged line in the dust and blood. He didn't take a cent of the money. He didn't take the weapons. He took the only thing that mattered in the underworld: the names of the guilty. Outside, the tide was coming in. The salt air stung his wounds, a familiar ache that reminded him he was still the child of the gallows. But as he looked toward the shimmering lights of Seoul's skyline, he knew the Trinity was already feeling the cold. The first extraction was complete. The debt was being called in. The gallows didn't have a floor. It had a skin of rusted iron and congealed oil. In the belly of a decommissioned supertanker, the heat was a physical weight, pressing the breath back into the lungs of anyone foolish enough to inhale. A 12-year-old Junho stood in the center of the engine room, his feet slipping on the slick hull. He held a pipe, heavy and blunt. Across from him, Madame Kane sat on an overturned chemical drum, the smoke from her cigarette curling into the darkness like a beckoning ghost. She wasn't watching him with pity. She was watching him like an engineer watches a stress test. "Again," she said. The beasts emerged from the shadows. 3 men, their bodies corded with the hard, ugly muscle of shipyard laborers. They didn't carry weapons. They didn't need them. They moved in, and the world became a blur of heavy boots and calloused knuckles. Junho swung the pipe, a desperate, wide arc that met nothing but air. A fist caught him in the solar plexus, folding him double. A boot followed, sending him skidding across the iron floor until his back slammed into a bulkhead. The boy coughed, a spray of red hitting the rust. He looked at the pipe, then at the men closing in. His hands shook. "The Trinity gave you a name, Jun-Ho." Kane's voice drifted through the heat, cold as a winter tide. "They called you peace. But out here, peace is just the silence before the scavengers arrive. If you want to breathe, you have to be the thing that makes them stop." Jun-Ho scrambled up. One of the men, a giant with a tattooed throat, lunged. Jun-Ho didn't swing this time. He dropped. He felt the rush of air as the blow passed over his head, and he drove the end of the pipe into the man's kneecap with every ounce of his borrowed spite. The crack of bone echoed in the hollow hull. The man went down, snarling. Madam Kane stood up, the light catching the gold in her teeth. She walked to the edge of the pit and looked down at the boy. "Better. But the pipe is a beggar's tool. It waits for the opening. You need a tool that creates one." She led him deeper into the ship's graveyard, to a section where the hull had been torn open by an industrial torch. Amidst the jagged wreckage lay a slab of blackened steel, 6 inches thick and 5 feet long. It was a section of the ship's keel, the literal spine that had held 100,000 tons of cargo against the crushing weight of the ocean. "The shipyard fires couldn't melt it," Kane said, pointing to the slab. "The salt couldn't rot it. It's been under pressure since before you were born. It doesn't know how to break." She handed him a grinding wheel. "Shape it. Not into a sword. A sword is for poets and princes. Shape it into a consequence. Make it as heavy as the debt they owe you." For 3 years, the sound of the grinder became Jun-Ho's heartbeat. He didn't eat until his hands bled. He didn't sleep until the edge of the steel could split a falling hair. He learned the physics of the weight, how to use the momentum of the slab to carry his small frame, how to turn a miss into a secondary strike, how to let the blade do the work of 1,000 men. He grew into his scars. His frame filled out with the dense, functional muscle of a dock worker, but his eyes remained those of the child left behind, empty, waiting to be filled. One night, the beasts came for him for the final time. Madam Kane had stopped the controlled sparring. She had told the shipyard bosses that whoever brought her the boy's head could have his share of the black market rations. 7 men entered the hull. They brought chains, machetes, and the hunger of the desperate. Jun-Ho stood in the center of the forge, the blackened slab resting on his shoulder. He didn't wait for them to circle. He moved first. The spine of the Leviathan whistled through the air, a sound like a coming gale. The first man tried to block with a crowbar. The slab sheared through the iron and the man's skull in a single, sickening crunch. He didn't dance. He didn't pose. He moved with a terrifying, predatory economy. He used the walls of the hull to bounce the weight of the blade, creating arcs of steel that cleared the room in seconds. When the last man tried to run, Jun-Ho didn't chase. He threw the slab. The 5-foot blade spun through the air, pinning the man to the bulkhead by his torso, the steel vibrating with a low, humming frequency. The silence that followed was absolute. Madam Kane walked into the forge, stepping over the ruins of the men she had sent to kill him. She looked at the blade, then at Jun-Ho. He was covered in oil, soot, and the blood of the only family he had known for 3 years. "They think they created a monster to guard their docks," Kane whispered, her hand hovering near his face but never touching. They don't realize they created a god to burn their towers. You're done here, Junho. The gallows have nothing left to teach you. She reached into her suit jacket and pulled out a worn, salt-crusted wooden crane, the toy his uncle had handed over as a receipt. She dropped it at his feet. Go to Seoul, she said. Show them what the collateral looks like when it comes back to collect. Junho picked up the toy. He didn't look back at the bodies or the woman who had forged him. He grabbed the handle of the spine of the Leviathan and pulled it from the metal wall. The ship groaned, as if mourning the loss of its heart. He walked out of the hull and into the gray light of the Incheon docks, the god of the blade born from the rot of the beasts. The debt was no longer a concept. It was a weight in his hands, and it was time to carry it to the chairman's door. The 44th floor of the Kang Tower was a tomb of frosted glass and humming cooling fans. So he didn't look at the monitors. She didn't need to. The red scrolling text on her terminal reflected in her pupils. Breach detected. Clearing house offline. Asset liquidation in progress. She felt the vibration in the floor before the alarm triggered. It wasn't the elevator. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of the internal security teams, the cleanup crew, moving toward her wing. Chairman Kong had realized the leak wasn't a glitch. He had realized the ghost had a heartbeat. So he stood, her fingers dancing across the haptic keyboard one last time. She didn't pack a bag. She grabbed a single encrypted drive and a subcompact pistol she had hidden in the hollowed-out base of a server rack. The door to the tech suite hissed open. 4 men in pressurized suits, their faces obscured by polarized visors, stepped into the blue light. They didn't issue commands. They raised silenced carbines. A window behind them shattered. It didn't shatter inward from a projectile. It exploded outward as a charcoal shadow surged from the exterior maintenance lift. Junho didn't land. He impacted. The weight of the spine of the Leviathan hit the polished marble floor first, sending a shockwave that buckled the tiles. Before the lead security operative could adjust his aim, Junho swung the slab in a rising vertical. The blackened steel caught the man under the chin, lifting him 3 feet off the ground and launching him into the ceiling tiles. The room filled with the smell of ozone and pulverized stone. So he dropped behind her desk. The remaining 3 men opened fire. The suppressed rounds pinged off the flat of Junho's blade, tink, tink, thud, as he used the massive iron sheet as a mobile barricade. He moved with the predatory economy of a shark in shallow water, closing the distance in 2 lunges. He didn't waste movement on fancy parries. He stepped through the gunfire, took a round to the thigh that tore through the hanbok fabric, and countered with a horizontal sweep that took the legs out from under 2 men. As they fell, he brought the edge of the spine down like a guillotine. The 4th man turned to run. Junho didn't chase. He reached out, grabbed the man by the webbing of his tactical vest, and slammed him face first into the server rack so he had just vacated. The glass shattered. The servers sparked, dying in a shower of blue electricity. Silence returned, punctuated only by the dying whine of a cooling fan. Junho stood amidst the wreckage, his breathing shallow and controlled. Blood dripped from his leg, staining the pristine white marble. He looked at Sohee. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. He didn't ask if she was hurt. "You're compromised," he said. Sohee stood, brushing glass from her blazer. She looked at the ruined men on the floor, then at the man who had cleaved them. The chairman knows. He didn't wait for proof. He just signaled the purge. Then the audit moves faster, Junho replied. He wiped a smear of blood from the spine using the sleeve of a fallen guard. He's moved to the bunker at the Incheon refineries, so he said, sliding the drive into her pocket. He's calling in the other two families, the Park and Choi syndicates. They think you're a collective threat to the consolidation. They aren't just defending a name anymore. They're defending the treaty. The treaty is dead, Junho said. He turned toward the shattered window, the wind from the 44th floor whipping his charcoal robes. It died the day they left the collateral in the rust. They have a private army waiting at the docks, Junho. Not mercenaries, fanatics. Men who owe their lives to the Kang bloodline. Junho paused, his hand tightening on the grip of the blackened steel. He looked out at the city, the grid of lights that looked like a motherboard from this height. Madam Kane told me once that a dog is loyal to the hand that feeds it. But a beast is loyal only to the hunt. He looked back at her. Are you a dog, Sohee? Or are you a beast? Sohee looked at her terminal, now a blackened hunk of melted plastic and sparks. She looked at the pistol in her hand. I'm the one who knows where the bodies are buried, and I'm tired of digging. Good. Junho stepped toward the ledge. Then stop digging and start pointing. We're going back to where it started. He grabbed a rappelling line from the maintenance lift and kicked off into the void. Sohee didn't hesitate. She followed him into the dark, leaving the burning heart of the Kang Empire behind. The ghost was no longer in the machine. She was in the field. And the god of the blade finally had a map to the architect's throat. The penthouse of the Choi estate was a cage of gold and reinforced polycarbonate suspended above the city like a god's judgment. Inside, the air was filtered, chilled, and scented with expensive cedar. There was no sound of the street, no smell of the sea. Chairman Kang sat at a triangular table of obsidian glass. To his left, Matriarch Park, her fingers heavy with jade. To his right, Director Choi, a man whose skin was as translucent as the ledgers he manipulated. The trinity was complete, but the atmosphere was not one of triumph. It was an autopsy. The clearinghouse is a graveyard, Choi said, his voice a dry rasp. The digital reserves are hemorrhaging. We aren't just losing money, we're losing the record of who owes us. Without the debt, we have no leverage. He isn't after the money, Kang said. He stared at a crystal glass of scotch, the ice long since melted. He's erasing the architecture. He's tearing down the walls so he can see the people hiding inside. You signed the treaty, Kang. Park hissed, her eyes sharp. You said the boy was a loose end that the gallows would swallow. Now he's at our gates, and he's carrying a piece of a freighter as a walking stick. This isn't a rebellion. It's a correction. Kang looked up, his face a mask of weary arrogance. He was a child. I gave him to Madam Kane to be broken. I didn't know she was a blacksmith. A holographic display flickered to life in the center of the table. It showed a grainy, low-angle shot from a security drone near the Incheon perimeter. A figure in charcoal robes walked through a wall of fire, the spine of the Leviathan slung low. The figure didn't look up at the drone. He didn't need to. A second later, the screen went to static. He's moving toward the refineries, Choi noted, his hand trembling as he adjusted his glasses. The Park and Choi security details are already in position. 200 men, high-frequency dampeners, armor-piercing rounds. He's a man with a slab of iron, Kang. Physics says he dies at the first gate. Physics didn't raise him, Kang replied. The beasts did. The doors to the penthouse didn't burst open. They slid back with a soft, pneumatic hiss. A sub-commander of the Trinity's combined forces entered, his face pale. He didn't look at the other directors. He looked only at Kang. Sir, the Incheon gate has been silent for 10 minutes. Explain, Choi demanded. No distress calls, no gunfire, just silence. We sent a drone in. The men are still at their posts. They just don't have heads. The silence in the penthouse became a vacuum. The glass ceiling, designed to show the Trinity the world they owned, now felt like a target. They were at the highest point in the city, and they had never felt more vulnerable. He's calling in the default, Park whispered, her jade rings clicking together. He's not coming for the chair. He's coming for the bloodline. Kang stood up, walking to the massive floor-to-ceiling window. Below him, the lights of Seoul flickered like a dying nervous system. He could see the distant orange glow of the refineries on the horizon. He realized then that he hadn't created a weapon to guard his secrets. He had created a god to punish his sins. Double the guard on this floor, Kang ordered, though his voice lacked conviction. Get the chopper on the roof. We will move to the offshore rig. We can't fly, the sub-commander said, his voice shaking. The flight systems were slave to the clearinghouse. The ghost locked the rotors. We're grounded. Kang pressed his forehead against the cold glass. He looked at his reflection, a man who had sold a child to buy a kingdom. Behind him, the other two masters of the Trinity were already arguing, casting blame, scrambling for exits that no longer existed. He didn't join them. He just watched the horizon, waiting for the flicker of a blackened blade to catch the light. The Trinity was no longer a syndicate. It was a harvest. And the reaper was coming home to the docks. The air at the Incheon docks didn't just smell of salt. It tasted of corrosion. This was the marrow of the gallows, a labyrinth of stacked shipping containers that had become a graveyard for men and machines alike. Jun-ho moved through the narrow corridors of rusted steel, his boots silent on the salt-crusted asphalt. He didn't need a map. His body remembered every corner where he had bled, every shadow where he had hidden as a child, while the beasts hunted him for sport. A heavy chain rattled above. From the top of a red Maersk container, a man dropped. He was massive, his skin tanned to the texture of leather, his arms covered in the crude blue ink of the dock slayers. This was Guan, the man who had broken Jun-ho's arm 20 years ago for a half-eaten ration bar. He didn't carry a gun. He held a massive industrial hook attached to a motorized winch. The little bird came back to the nest, Guan growled, the winch humming as the hook began to spin. Jun-ho stopped. He didn't reach for the spine on his back. He stood with his arms at his sides, his charcoal hanbok fluttering in the damp sea breeze. He looked at Guan not with hatred, but with the cold detachment of a man looking at a broken gear. You were the strongest of them, Jun-ho said. I used to dream about the sound your bones would make when they finally snapped. Guan roared, launching the hook. It whistled through the air, a jagged curve of steel meant to disembowel. Jun-ho didn't dodge. He stepped into the arc. He caught the steel cable with a gloved hand, the friction smoking against his palm, and
Cold. The strength wasn't human. Guan was jerked off his feet, his massive frame flying forward. Junho met him mid-air with a closed fist to the throat. The sound was a dull thud, followed by the wet, frantic gasping of a crushed windpipe. Guan hit the ground, clutching his neck, his eyes bulging with the sudden realization that the prey had outgrown the predator. More shadows shifted. 5, 10, 20. The beasts of the lower docks emerged. Men who had survived on the Trinity's table scraps, conditioned to fear nothing but hunger. They saw Guan on the ground and hesitated. They saw the blackened slab of iron on Junho's back and felt a primal, instinctual dread. "Madam Kane sent us a message," one of them shouted, brandishing a sharpened rebar. "She said the collateral was cancelled. She said you're just a ghost now." "She didn't lie," Junho said. He reached back and drew the spine of the Leviathan. The metal groaned as it left the oilcloth, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in the chests of the men standing before him. He didn't wait for their charge. He moved like a scythe through dry grass. The first swing was a low, horizontal sweep that sheared through 3 pairs of legs at the shins. The screams were cut short by the return arc, a rising vertical that split a man from pelvis to chin. Junho wasn't fighting. He was harvesting. He used the momentum of the heavy slab to pivot, turning the weight of the ship's keel into a whirlwind of absolute destruction. A mercenary tried to climb a container to get a line of sight with a crossbow. Junho didn't even look up. He drove the tip of the spine into the base of the container and twisted. The rusted steel buckled, the entire 30-ton box shifting and crushing the man against the bulkhead behind him. The remaining men broke. They were beasts, but even beasts know when they are being hunted by something from a higher plane. They fled into the fog, leaving Guan alone, still gasping on the salt-crusted ground. Junho stood over him. He sheathed the blade. He reached into his hanbok and pulled out a small, jagged piece of rusted iron, the shard he had used to defend himself 20 years ago. He dropped it onto Guan's chest. "Interest," Junho whispered. He looked up toward the central refinery towers, where the orange flare stacks licked the dark sky. The beasts were settled. The salt had been washed away with iron. There was only one debt left on the ledger, and it sat in a bunker of reinforced concrete, waiting for God to come home. He walked past the groaning man and into the heart of the refinery. The docks were silent now, the only sound the rising tide and the distant, rhythmic thumping of the fire. The audit was almost over. The Incheon refinery was a forest of steel pillars and hissing steam pipes, illuminated by the rhythmic, hellish pulse of the flare stacks. Deep within the primary bunker, Chairman Kong sat before a wall of monitors. Every screen was a flat, dead gray. The ghost hadn't just cut the power. She had rewritten the server's firmware. The Trinity's security network was no longer a shield. It was an observer. A single monitor flickered to life. It didn't show Junho's face. It showed a document. The original, salt-crusted collateral treaty from 20 years ago. As Kong watched, a digital red line began to strike through the names of the signatories. Director Choi, liquidated. Matriarch Park, in default. The red line hovered over Chairman Kong. "He's in the perimeter," the bunker's intercom crackled. the voice distorted by high-frequency interference. "He didn't use the service tunnels. He's coming through the pressure valves." Outside, the night air was ripped apart by a sound like a ship's hull snapping in a storm. Jun-ho stood atop the main gas line, the spine of the Leviathan embedded deep in the reinforced valve housing. He didn't use explosives. He used the blade as a lever, his dense, shipyard-forged muscles straining against the hanbok as he forced the industrial seal. The valve groaned, then shrieked. A geyser of pressurized steam erupted, cloaking the catwalks in a blinding white fog. The bunker's elite guard, the Hounds, men who had been paid in Kong's blood money for decades, moved into the mist. They wore thermal HUDs and carried high-pressure liquid nitrogen sprayers designed to brittle steel and shatter bones. They moved in a phalanx, their boots clanging on the metal grating. The first Hound felt a vibration in the catwalk. Not a footstep, but a hum. The spine emerged from the steam not as a sword, but as a pendulum. Jun-ho had swung himself beneath the catwalk, using the pipes like the rigging of a ghost ship. He surged upward, the blackened slab shearing through the grating and the two men standing on it. The metal floor buckled upward, sending the Hounds into the venting steam. He landed in the center of their formation. He didn't speak. He didn't offer terms. A Hound triggered a nitrogen spray. Jun-ho didn't
Dodge. He spun the spine in a tight vertical circle, the heavy steel acting as a thermal heat sink. The liquid nitrogen hissed and evaporated against the blackened blade. Before the Hound could reload, Jun-ho stepped into his guard and drove the pommel of the blade into the man's chest. The tactical vest shattered. The ribs followed. He was a ghost in the machine, a shadow that the thermal optics couldn't track because he was as cold as the steel he carried. Inside the bunker, the final monitor changed. The treaty vanished, replaced by a live feed from the catwalks. Kong watched in a trance of terror as his finest men were dismantled with the surgical coldness of a butcher. Jun-ho wasn't just killing them. He was clearing the ledger. The feed cut to a close-up of the wooden crane. It sat on a control console outside the bunker's blast door. "The default notice has been served," Sohee's voice echoed through the bunker's speakers, calm and lethal. "The Trinity is bankrupt, Chairman. Not in money. In life." Kong reached for his sidearm, but his hand shook too violently to unholster it. He looked at the blast door. 4 feet of reinforced tungsten. It was designed to survive a nuclear strike. On the other side, Jun-ho stood in the silence of the steam. He reached back and gripped the handle of the spine with both hands. He planted his feet, feeling the vibration of the refinery's core beneath his boots. He wasn't thinking about revenge. He was thinking about the physics of the debt. He swung. The sound wasn't a hit, it was an ending. The spine of the Leviathan hit the center of the blast door with the concentrated force of 20 years of abandonment. The tungsten didn't just dent. It groaned as the hinges began to scream. Jun-ho drew the blade back for a second strike. He looked at the wooden crane sitting on the console. The child was gone. The beast was dead. There was only God, and the final audit was 1 strike away. The blast door didn't fall. It surrendered. The tungsten slab groaned off its tracks, leaning inward like a dying giant. Dust and the smell of ozone flooded the sanctum, coating the expensive scotch and the obsidian furniture in a layer of industrial gray. Jun-ho stepped over the threshold. His charcoal hanbok was shredded at the shoulder, revealing the map of scars that served as his only history. He didn't look at Chairman Kong, who was cowering behind the central desk. He looked at the room, the siege tower of the Kong Empire. This was the brain of the machine that had ground his childhood into profit. The final line of defense emerged from the shadows behind the chairman. These were the Apostles, the elite trio of personal assassins who had never left Kong's side. They didn't wear tactical gear or carry firearms. They wore traditional silks and held weapons of refined elegance, a rapier of white gold, a pair of weighted chain sickles, and a staff of reinforced carbon fiber. They were the princes of the blade. Junho was the god of the slab. The apostle with the rapier moved first. He was a blur of white silk and precision, his blade whistling toward Junho's throat in a series of flickering thrusts. Junho didn't parry. He tilted his head a fraction of an inch, letting the white gold tip graze his neck. He moved forward, not away, and used the flat of the spine of the Leviathan to shove the apostle into the path of the chain sickles. The room became a chaotic geometry of steel. The chain sickles hissed through the air, wrapping around the handle of Junho's blade. The apostle pulled, trying to disarm him with superior leverage. Junho didn't resist the pull. He accelerated into it. He let the momentum carry him, driving the massive blackened slab into the floor. The obsidian desk shattered under the weight. He released the handle with one hand, grabbed the chain, and yanked the apostle toward him. He met the man mid-flight with a knee to the sternum that sounded like a dry branch snapping. The staff user swung from the flank, a crushing blow aimed at Junho's temple. Junho caught the staff with his bare hand, the friction burning his palm, and didn't let go. He stared into the apostle's eyes, the empty, disciplined eyes of a man who had been taught to fight in a gym. "You move like a dancer," Junho said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. "The beasts would have eaten you in a night." He twisted the staff, the carbon fiber splintering, and used the jagged end to pin the man's foot to the floor. In the same motion, he reclaimed the spine and delivered a horizontal cleave that ended the apostle with the rapier. The white silk was no longer white. Chairman Kong watched from the corner, his mouth moving in a silent prayer or a plea for mercy that didn't exist in this zip code. He saw his invincible guards falling not to a master of technique, but to a force of nature. Junho wasn't using a style. He was using the accumulated weight of 20 years of gravity. The last apostle, chain user, backed away, his face pale. He looked at the blackened slab of iron, the spine, and saw the notch he had made in it. He realized the metal wasn't just steel. It was a record of every strike it had ever taken. It was an unbreakable debt. Junho stepped over the bodies of the first two. He didn't hurry. He didn't show anger. He showed the absolute, terrifying boredom of a man finishing a job. The apostle lunged one last time, a desperate, wide swing of the sickle. Junho didn't even use the edge. He used the mass of the blade's side to slap the weapon out of the air, then followed through with a thrust that took the apostle through the chest, pinning him to the reinforced polycarbonate wall behind the chairman. The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sound was the rhythmic drip, drip of blood from the spine, and the frantic, shallow breathing of the chairman. Junho turned his gaze to his uncle. He stood in the center of the ruined sanctum, the charcoal robes hanging off his frame like a shroud. He looked at the man who had traded him for a trade route, the man who had forgotten his face but remembered his value. "The siege is over, Uncle," Junho said. He didn't raise the blade. He just stood there, a relic of the gallows in the heart of the tower. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden crane, placing it on the edge of the chairman's shattered desk. The tower is empty. The apostles are dead. The Trinity is bankrupt. Kang looked at the toy, his eyes filling with a sudden, pathetic recognition.
Junho, I did it for the family. We would have lost everything.
You did lose everything, Junho replied. You just didn't notice until the collateral came home. He turned his back on the chairman, walking toward the shattered blast door. He didn't kill the man. He left him in a room full of corpses and a toy he couldn't play with, surrounded by the wreckage of a kingdom that no longer existed. The audit of the tower was complete. Only the final settlement remained. The Incheon refineries were no longer screaming. The flare stacks had been choked to a low rhythmic pulse, casting a bruised violet light over the cooling concrete. Silence had returned to the gallows, but it was a new kind of silence, not the fearful hush of the hunted, but the heavy stillness that follows a landslide. Junho walked out of the bunker's shadow and toward the edge of the pier. The spine of the Leviathan trailed behind him, its tip carving a shallow, jagged line through the salt and the soot. He stopped where the concrete gave way to the black, oily water of the harbor. So he was waiting by the remains of a rusted crane. She didn't have her laptop or her pistol. She stood with her hands in the pockets of a dark coat, her eyes scanning the horizon where the first hint of gray was beginning to bleed into the sky. The chairman is still alive, she said. It wasn't a question. He is in a room with his ghosts, Junho replied. Death would have been a credit. I left him with the debt. So he nodded. She reached out and handed him a small physical ledger, the one he had taken from the clearinghouse. The Trinity is effectively erased. The Park and Choi families are liquidating what's left of their assets to flee the country. The power vacuum is already being filled by the smaller syndicates. They're terrified, Junho. They saw what one man did to a god. Junho looked at the water. A piece of driftwood bobbed in the oil slick, moving with the tide. I am not a man, and I am not a god. I am the result of a trade. He unslung the spine from his back. He held the massive blackened slab of iron over the water. For 20 years, this metal had been his heartbeat, his language, and his only companion among the beasts. It was etched with the blood of the men who had abandoned him and the men who had tried to finish the job. You let go. The splash was heavy and final. The spine of the Leviathan sank into the silt of the harbor, returning to the pressure and the dark where it had been forged. Junho's shoulders dropped an inch, not from weakness, but from the sudden, jarring absence of the weight. What happens now? So he asked. The city will want a new architect. The gallows will want a new matriarch. Madame Kane is already moving her pieces. Junho turned to look at her. For the first time, the predatory economy of his motion was gone. He moved like a man who was simply tired. He reached into his hanbok and pulled out the wooden crane, its surface polished smooth by his scarred thumb. The audit is closed, he said. He didn't drop the toy. He placed it carefully on the rusted base of the crane, a small, fragile monument to the child who had died so God could live. He walked past So-hee, moving toward the edge of the shipyard where the city lights were beginning to dim. He didn't look at the skyscrapers of Seoul, and he didn't look back at the shipping containers of Incheon. He walked toward the gray line of the horizon. "The beasts are gone," he whispered to the wind, "and God is finished." So he watched him until he was nothing more than a charcoal smudge against the morning fog. She looked at the wooden crane, then at the black water where the blade rested. She realized then that Junho hadn't just destroyed the Trinity. He had destroyed the idea that a life could be collateral. The god of the blade was a legend now, a story told in the back alleys and the boardrooms to keep the greedy awake at night. But the man who had walked away was something far more dangerous. He was free. The sun broke over the harbor, cold and indifferent, illuminating a world where the ledgers were empty and the debt was finally, fully paid.